Captain Murren Thorne leaned back in her chair, the kind of chair that squeaked every time you thought about comfort. She liked it that way. Quarters on the Dauntless weren't exactly a model of luxury, more like a model of barely holding together, with duct tape being the primary decorator's touch. Ariadne liked to think it gave the place character, much like the ship herself. "So," she announced to her crew, "we've apparently stumbled upon a planet with a core so unstable it makes a politician's promises look rock solid." Lieutenant Cade, her second-in-command and a man whose face would make a weasel look trustworthy, smirked from his station. "Let me guess, the Zalkron are involved." The crew collectively groaned. The Zalkron Empire, the galaxy's answer to a bad rash. It didn't matter what cream you used, it just wouldn't go away. "Bingo," Ariadne replied, her grin as wide as the expanse outside their viewport. "Seems they've been using the planet's core as a sort of cosmic bully stick, waving it around to keep everyone in line." "Charming," grumbled Dr. Celine, the ship's medical officer and professional pessimist. "And we're here because, Ariadne said, leaning forward with all the seriousness of a used spaceship salesman, "we're going to take a closer look." "Closer look," Celine echoed, eyebrows arching to the point they might meet her hairline. "You mean the kind of closer look that leaves us all as charcoal briquettes?" Ariadne shrugged, an expert in the art of nonchalance. "Well, someone's got to see if they left the keys in the ignition." Cade sighed, fingers dancing over his console with the grace of a drunken ballerina. "I suppose you're expecting us not to die in the process." "That would be ideal," Ariadne replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But if we do, I promise to write glowing obituaries for each of you. Heroic idiots perish in the line of extreme curiosity." The crew chuckled, the sound echoing through the cramped bridge. Gallows humor was their lifeline, a necessary buffer against the reality of their situation. Outside, the void of space stretched endlessly, a reminder of both their insignificance and their stubborn refusal to be erased from existence. They had encountered the planet by accident, a routine patrol through what was supposed to be uninhabited space. The universe, however, had a funny way of throwing curveballs, usually made of lead and aimed directly at your head. "What exactly do we know about this rock?" asked Thal, the Dauntless's engineer, who seemed to survive on caffeine and bad decisions. His hair stuck up at odd angles, the result of a close encounter with the ship's wiring. "Not much," Ariadne admitted, fiddling with the holographic image of the planet hovering above the table. "The core's hot enough to melt durasteel, and the Zalkron are using it to keep the local systems in check. Intimidation 101. So, pretty much standard operating procedure for them," Cade said dryly. Ariadne nodded. "Except this time they've wrapped it up in the biggest bomb you've ever seen. If they decide to toss their toys out of the pram, half the sector goes with it. And we're the lucky bastards sent to defuse it," Celine said with morbid cheer. "Just once I'd like a mission where our survival isn't a plot twist." The crew chuckled again, a thread of camaraderie weaving through their pessimism. They were a motley bunch, held together by the strongest glue known to mankind, the shared experience of being in over their heads. "Let's get a closer look," Ariadne repeated, more to herself than anyone else. She punched a button on the console, and the Dauntless lurched forward, engines humming with a noise that suggested contemplation of early retirement. The planet loomed ahead, a blue-green marble shrouded in clouds that swirled with an ominous energy. It was beautiful in the way a coiled snake might be. It promised beauty and death with equal measure. As they approached, the ship's scanners buzzed with activity. Cade frowned at the readouts. "Looks like the Zalkrons got a fleet in orbit." "Of course they do," Ariadne said, her tone suggesting she'd expected nothing less. "It'd be too easy otherwise. And here I was hoping for a nice, quiet day," Thal muttered, securing his tools with the practiced ease of someone who'd been thrown across a room too many times. "Just think of it as a chance to work on your evasive maneuvers," Ariadne said, her voice light but her eyes steely. "We can't let them keep this thing." Cade's fingers danced over his console again, pulling up any information he could find on the Zalcron fleet. 3 cruisers and a destroyer, he reported, his tone grim but not surprised. Nice to see they're not underestimating us, Ariadne quipped. All right, let's see if we can outmaneuver them. The Dauntless plunged into action, engines flaring as they raced toward the planet. The Zalcron fleet responded with the enthusiasm of a cat that's just noticed a particularly fat mouse. Here they come, Cade said unnecessarily, as the ship shuddered under the impact of enemy fire. Everyone hold on to your lunch, Ariadne called, gripping the armrests of her chair with white-knuckled intensity. The ship twisted and rolled, a dance of desperation and defiance. The crew held on, their expressions a mix of focus and sheer bloody-mindedness. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and quite possibly out of their minds, but they'd faced worse odds before. If we survive this, Thal grunted, holding onto his console as the ship banked hard, I'm buying the first round. You always say that, Celine shot back, and yet I'm still waiting for my drink. Consider it motivation, Ariadne said, her voice tight with concentration. Let's give these bastards a show. The Dauntless darted between the enemy ships, a blur of movement and defiance. Lasers seared past them, close enough to make the hull groan in protest. Hull integrity at 85%, Cade reported, his voice steady despite the chaos. And my blood pressure at 200%, Ariadne muttered, guiding the ship with all the skill and determination of someone who had no intention of dying today. They broke through the enemy line, the planet looming larger in the viewport. It was a fleeting victory, but a victory nonetheless. We're in, Ariadne announced, her voice a mix of triumph and defiance. Now let's see what makes this rock tick. The ship descended, the atmosphere buffeting them with all the subtlety of a bar brawl. The controls shuddered in her grip, but Ariadne held firm, guiding the Dauntless with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The surface of the planet rushed up to meet them, a patchwork of green and blue that promised both beauty and danger. They landed with a jolt, the ship settling into the ground with a creak of protest. Well, Cade said, unbuckling his harness with a sigh of relief. That was impressively suicidal. And yet here we are, Ariadne replied, flashing him a grin that was part relief, part challenge. The crew disembarked, the planet's atmosphere thick and heavy around them. The air was charged, an electric thrill that set their nerves on edge. Let's find out what the Zalcron are up to, Ariadne said, her voice firm and determined. And let's make sure they don't get to use this thing. The crew nodded, a silent agreement to face whatever lay ahead. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and as always out of their depth. But they were human, and that meant they were stubborn as hell. They moved forward, a ragtag group of misfits and heroes, ready to defy an empire and tip the scales in favor of a galaxy that was just a little less controlled by maniacs with planet-sized bombs. As they approached the core site, an uneasy silence fell over them, broken only by the hum of alien machinery. The Zalcron's handiwork was a testament to madness and genius, a contraption that promised destruction and dominion. Ariadne paused, her gaze fixed on the pulsating core, glowing ominously in the dim light. Well, this just screams do not touch, she quipped, a smile playing on her lips despite the danger. So naturally we're going to touch it, Thal said, his tone resigned but hopeful. Because why wouldn't we? Ariadne nodded, her expression fierce and determined. Let's give the Zalcron something to worry about. As they moved toward the core, the weight of the universe seemed to press down on them. But they were human, and that meant they were stubborn, clever, and just crazy enough to think they might actually win. In the face of certain doom, they did the only thing they could. They moved forward, ready to face whatever lay ahead with wit, courage, and a perhaps unhealthy dose of optimism. Ariadne studied the pulsating core with the kind of intensity usually reserved for dodgy hyperdrive repairs or last-minute tax filings. She grimaced, rubbing her temples, the kind of look you'd see on a cat contemplating a bath. This isn't just any bomb. This is a masterpiece of impending doom, Cade leaned against a bulkhead, arms folded like the universe's most relaxed villain. So, Captain, what's the plan? Hope they all die of natural causes. No, we infiltrate, Ariadne said, with the air of someone suggesting a nice afternoon stroll rather than a suicidal mission. The Zalkron love their gambling, right? We set up a casino, get them in, and then we improvise. Doctor. Celine raised an eyebrow, clearly wondering if she'd misheard or if Ariadne had finally lost the few marbles she still had. We're going to outsmart space lizards with blackjack. Think about it, Ariadne insisted, a glint of desperation mingling with her usual nonchalance. Their cultural obsession with luck is their Achilles heel. We give them a taste of our games, get them distracted. While they're busy blowing their salaries on cards, we sneak in and figure out how to shut this thing down. Thal chuckled, shaking his head as he tightened a bolt on his latest contraption. Betting on their stupidity, I like it. It's almost as crazy as it is brilliant. And if it fails miserably, Cade asked, not so much a question as a prediction. Then we die spectacularly, Ariadne replied with a shrug. But at least we'll go down with style. Celine sighed, her pessimism palpable. Death by casino, at least it's original. Exactly, Ariadne said, clapping her hands together with false cheer. Let's get this show on the road. The crew got to work, transforming the Dauntless's cramped cargo hold into a makeshift den of vice and deception. The irony wasn't lost on Ariadne that their ship's quarters were now in better shape than the captain's cabin. Flickering lights and scavenged tables created an ambience that was half seedy dive, half interstellar snare. There was an undeniable charm to its shabbiness, the kind that said, "We'll rob you, but you'll have fun." Looks like a gambler's paradise, Thal said, surveying their handiwork with a critical eye. If they ask for a health inspection, we're screwed. Luckily, the Zalkron aren't known for their hygiene standards, Cade pointed out, handing Ariadne a deck of cards. Ariadne shuffled the cards with practiced ease, the slap of cardboard on cardboard a promise of mischief to come. Time to bait the trap. Word spread quickly among the Zalkron, as word tends to when it involves the chance to lose a fortune. The crew watched from the shadows as their first guests arrived, a collection of scales, arrogance, and impractical uniforms. The Zalkron ambled in, their eyes alight with the thrill of the gamble, the shiny promise of luck and wealth. "Here we go," Ariadne whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Showtime. The first few hours were a blur of games and guile. Cards snapped against tables, dice clattered with the urgency of impending poverty, and chips, carefully fabricated from otherwise useless ship parts, exchanged hands at a dizzying pace. The Zalkron were entranced, their competitive spirit overriding any suspicion they might have had about the humans' sudden hospitality. Ariadne played the part of congenial hostess with aplomb, her smile as sharp as a plasma blade. "Step right up, ladies and gents, and see if luck's on your side tonight." Cade worked the floor, whispering sweet nothings about odds and probabilities that made even the most stoic Zalkron twitch with excitement. "You know, it's said that human games are the true test of fate." One Zalkron leaned in, clutching his winning hand like a lifeline. "These games, they are permitted by the Emperor." Cade flashed a grin that was part mischief, part madness. "We're operating on the Emperor's grace, my friend, all above board." The Zalkron nodded, reassured by Cade's complete lack of sincerity. They returned to their games with renewed vigor, oblivious to the humans' true intentions. "How long do you reckon before they catch on?" Thal asked, sidling up to Ariadne with a drink that looked suspiciously like engine degreaser. "Long enough, hopefully." Ariadne surveyed the scene, eyes darting over the crowd. "As long as we keep them entertained and a little bit tipsy, we should be fine." Celine, overseeing the medical supplies which now doubled as bar stock, shook her head. "Never thought my expertise in anesthesia would come in handy as a bartender." "Consider it a career expansion," Ariadne quipped, watching a particularly intense round of poker unfold. "If we survive this, I'll make you chief officer of recreational pharmaceuticals." Time ticked on, and the Zalkron continued to gamble, playing hands, rolling dice and gulping down drinks with reckless abandon. The ship was alive with the energy of deception and distraction, a carnival of chaos spinning towards its inevitable conclusion. Ariadne caught Cade's eye across the room, a silent signal that it was time for the next stage of their plan. They needed to gather information, schematics, codes, anything that could help them dismantle the Zalkron's doomsday device. "I'll distract the bigwigs," Cade said, sidling up beside Ariadne. "You and Thal see what kind of dirt you can dig up." Ariadne nodded, her expression set with determination. "Just keep them busy. I'd rather not have to explain why we're rifling through their files." With a theatrical flourish, Cade directed the attention of their guests to a new game, one involving a curious mix of human and Zalkron rules that left everyone equally confused and enthralled. It was the perfect distraction. Ariadne and Thal slipped away, moving through the ship's corridors with practiced stealth. They reached the interface terminal that connected to the Zalkron systems, a twisted mass of wires and alien tech that Thal approached with the enthusiasm of a kid in a candy store. "Let's see what secrets you're hiding," he muttered, fingers flying over the controls. Ariadne kept watch, listening for any sounds of unwanted visitors. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of the casino's activity, punctuated by Thal's occasional muttered curses. "Got it," Thal said finally, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "Coordinates, codes, and a layout of the control room." Ariadne grinned, the kind of grin you'd expect from someone who'd found a winning lottery ticket in a dumpster. "Great. Now let's get back before they realize their luck's run out." They returned to the casino, slipping back into their roles as if they'd never left. The Zalkron were none the wiser, still engrossed in their games, as oblivious as fish in a barrel. Cade met them with a questioning look, and Ariadne nodded, a silent confirmation that they'd got what they needed. As the night wore on, the Zalkron thinned out, leaving in various states of inebriation and bankruptcy. The dauntless crew closed down their operation, tired but victorious. They'd pulled it off, at least for now. "Drinks all around," Thal declared, pouring a round of dubious-looking liquid into mismatched glasses. "To beating the odds. To somehow surviving our own genius," Celine added, raising her glass with a wry smile. Ariadne joined the toast, her expression a mix of relief and resolve. There was still work to be done, and the specter of failure loomed large over their heads. But for the moment, they'd outsmarted the enemy, and that was worth celebrating. "Here's to human ingenuity," Cade said, clinking his glass against Ariadne's. "May it continue to get us into and out of trouble." They drank, the burn of the liquor a reminder that they were still alive, still fighting. The universe was vast and uncaring, but they were human, and that meant they were stubborn, defiant, and just a little bit crazy. "We've got what we need," Ariadne said, setting her glass down with a determined clink. "Next step is taking this thing apart without turning the planet into a fireworks display." Thal nodded, his gaze serious despite the alcohol-induced flush on his cheeks. "Just tell me what you need, Captain. I'll rig something up." Celine sighed, a touch of gloom in her voice even as she joined the camaraderie. "Let's just try not to die before we get to use our winnings." Ariadne chuckled, the sound rich with exhaustion and determination. "Deal. Now let's get some rest. Tomorrow we save a sector from blowing itself to smithereens." With that, the crew dispersed to their quarters, some to dream of the next daring plan, others to lie awake and contemplate their unlikely survival. The future was uncertain, the odds were long, but they faced it with the kind of reckless hope that only humans could muster. As Ariadne settled into her bunk, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. They'd outplayed the Zalkron, and for now, they held the upper hand. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new risks, but for tonight, they'd won a small victory in a universe determined to defeat them. "Here's to luck," she murmured, closing her eyes and letting sleep take her, the hum of the ship a comforting lullaby. "And here's to making our own." The next day, the Dauntless's cargo hold was once again bustling with the clamor of desperation masquerading as entertainment. Zalcron officials, those who held their positions mainly due to impressive connections rather than any real merit, wandered about like sharks who smelled blood in the water. They were here not just to gamble their fortunes away, but also to sniff out a whiff of impropriety. Ariadne Voss, captain and chief harbinger of chaos, stood at the helm of her creation, surveying the scene with the detached amusement of an arsonist admiring their handiwork. She had a talent for orchestrating disorder and the sharp eyes to appreciate its intricacies. "Looks like the sharks are circling," Cade observed, sidling up next to her with the casual demeanor of someone who hasn't quite figured out whether they are in over their head or just where they want to be. "Nah," Ariadne replied with a smirk. "Sharks have a purpose. These guys are more like bureaucratic jellyfish." Celine, ever the voice of cautious pessimism, hovered nearby. "How long do you think until they catch on that this isn't exactly sanctioned?" "That depends on how much they want to win versus how much they want to watch us squirm," Ariadne said, one eye on a particularly ostentatious official whose uniform looked like it had been designed by someone intent on winning a bet about gaudiness. "And from the looks of things, they're having too much fun to care." Thal, who was busy making not-so-subtle modifications to the roulette wheel, chimed in. "I'd give it 2 hours before someone gets suspicious enough to call for backup. Speaking of which, did you know their currency is about as stable as a Jenga tower in a hurricane?" Ariadne's ears perked up at this. "Oh, do tell." Turns out, Zalcron's economy is teetering on the brink. Their obsession with luck extends to their financial planning. Who knew betting entire planetary budgets on dice rolls wasn't a sustainable strategy? Cade snorted. "So, you're saying we can bankrupt them faster than I can say bad investment?" "Precisely," Thal said, grinning like a pirate who just stumbled upon a treasure chest marked "Do Not Open." As the casino continued to hum with deceit and poor life choices, the Zalcron officials kept their eyes peeled. It was clear they were trying to wrap their heads around the idea that these humans were either the most generous hosts in the galaxy or the biggest suckers they'd ever met. One particularly officious-looking Zalcron, with a badge that seemed to suggest he outranked his peers in self-importance, approached Ariadne. "Your games are intriguing," he said, in a tone that suggested he found them about as intriguing as watching paint dry. "Only the best for our guests," Ariadne replied smoothly, flashing a smile that could have cut glass. "We aim to please." He nodded, clearly not buying it but too polite or too curious to call her bluff just yet. "And you are certain these games are permitted by the Emperor?" "Absolutely," Ariadne lied, her poker face as impenetrable as the Dauntless's hull. "Wouldn't dream of violating Imperial edict." Cade chose that moment to intervene, sensing the tension and eager to diffuse it with a little charm and a lot of distraction. "How about we show you one of our more exotic games, guaranteed to make you question your life choices?" The official raised an eyebrow, suspicion dancing in his eyes. "I suppose it couldn't hurt." "Famous last words," Celine muttered under her breath, keeping an eye on the proceedings from her makeshift bar. As Cade led the official away, Ariadne turned to Thal and Celine. "We need to keep this rolling while we dig ourselves in deeper. Find out how we can use their instability to our advantage." Thal nodded, already formulating plans and backup plans in his head. "I'll see what I can pull from their systems without setting off alarms. Might be able to rig more games to bleed them dry faster." Celine sighed, resigning herself to yet another round of how can we survive what we've just done. "And I'll make sure no one drinks themselves into a stupor and spills the beans." Ariadne clapped her hands together, the sound a sharp echo in the chaos. "Great. Let's keep them distracted, keep them guessing, and keep our necks intact." The hours dragged on, the games growing more intense as the Zalcron officials got sucked into the thrill of it all. And with every hand dealt, every spin of the wheel, the dauntless crew chipped away at the Empire's already shaky foundations. "What's the worst that could happen?" Thal asked, almost rhetorically, as he studied the figures of their takings. "Famous last words," Cade repeated, returning to their side after successfully distracting the particularly nosy guest with a complicated card game that was primarily designed to confuse rather than entertain. Ariadne chuckled darkly. Worst case, we end up on a wanted poster in every sector from here to the Zalkron homeworld. Best case, Celine queried, her eyebrow raised. Ariadne shrugged. We walk away rich and infamous. Either way, we make history. The reality was, their situation was precarious, threading the needle between brilliance and disaster. The Zalkron were beginning to notice the thinning of their wallets, their confusion turning slowly into disgruntlement. The officials murmured amongst themselves, casting glances that suggested they were planning something more substantial than their next wager. We need another distraction, Celine said, nodding toward the growing knot of officials who were now talking in hushed, urgent tones. They're starting to look like they've realized they're dining on the Titanic. Ariadne considered this, a glint of mischief sparking in her eyes. Time for a little showmanship. Cade, think you can organize a little impromptu entertainment? Something flashy enough to keep their minds off their dwindling funds. Cade grinned, already seeing the outlines of a plan forming in his mind. Let's just say I've got a few tricks up my sleeve. As Cade disappeared to set his plan in motion, Ariadne watched him go, her expression a mix of confidence and resignation. You know, this could actually work. Or blow up spectacularly in our faces, Thal added cheerfully. Either way, it'll be one for the history books, Ariadne replied, sweeping her gaze over the bustling chaos of their makeshift casino. The minutes ticked by, each one a silent countdown to potential catastrophe. Then, with a flourish that could only be described as audaciously reckless, Cade returned to the center of the room, accompanied by a motley array of entertainers culled from the depths of the Dauntless's crew. It was a performance designed to distract, to dazzle, and to buy them precious time. The Zalkron's attention was immediately ensnared, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected spectacle. For a moment, the tension eased, the officials' focus diverted from the gnawing suspicion that something was amiss. Let's hope this keeps them busy for a while, Celine murmured, her eyes flicking between the performance and the gathered officials. As the antics unfolded, Thal leaned in closer to Ariadne, his voice low. I've got an idea. It's insane, but it might just work. Ariadne's eyes sparkled with interest. Those are my favorite kind. We rig the games even more, make the Zalkron think they're winning big for a bit, but slowly bleed them dry everything they've got, Thal explained. They'll get comfortable, think they're on a hot streak, and by the time they realize the truth, it'll be too late. Ariadne considered the plan, weighing the risks and the rewards. And if they catch us rigging things, Thal shrugged, then we'll just have to rely on our charming personalities to save us. Celine snorted. We're doomed. With a nod from Ariadne, Thal set to work, his fingers dancing over the interface with the precision of a virtuoso musician. The stakes were higher than ever, but the potential payoff was worth the gamble. The performance wound down, the crew's antics met with enthusiastic applause and relieved laughter from the Zalkron. The officials seemed pacified for the moment, their suspicions allayed by the diversion. As the games resumed, the dauntless crew watched with bated breath, hoping their gamble would pay off. The Zalkron, none the wiser, dove back into the games with renewed vigor, their greed blinding them to the trap that had been set. Hours passed, the tension in the air as thick as the smoke from the dubious drinks being passed around. Bit by bit, the Zalkron's fortunes dwindled, their confidence eroding with each losing hand, each missed opportunity. We're almost there, Thal whispered, his eyes glued to the numbers on his screen. Just a little longer. Ariadne's gaze swept over the room, assessing the situation. They were walking a tightrope, each step fraught with danger, each moment a calculated risk. Then, just as victory seemed within their grasp, a murmur rippled through the crowd. The Zalkron officials were gathering once more, their expressions grim and determined. Looks like they are on to us, Celine said, her voice tinged with resignation. Ariadne nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. Time to wrap this up and make our exit. Cade, ever the optimist in a sea of pessimism, cracked a grin. At least it's been fun. As the dauntless crew prepared to make their escape, Ariadne took one last look at the chaos they'd wrought, a sense of satisfaction mingling with the adrenaline coursing through her veins. To survival, improbable as it may be, she said, raising an invisible glass in a toast. And with that they made ready to leave, the promise of future challenges and adventures awaiting them beyond the stars, where the odds were long and the stakes even higher. "All right, we've officially pissed them off," Ariadne announced, glancing at the Zalkron officials huddled like a pack of angry wolves. Their murmured conspiracies thickened the air like a bad smell. And not the fun kind of pissed off, either. More like the get the torches and pitchforks kind. Cade, ever the optimist, was fiddling with a deck of cards, his demeanor as casual as a cat burglar caught with one leg through a window. "At least they're predictable," he said, flicking a card into the air and catching it with a flourish. "We knew they'd catch on eventually." Celine sighed, leaning against the makeshift bar, her usual sanctuary in the storm of chaos. Eventually was supposed to be tomorrow, not today. Anyone else feel like we're playing a game of chicken with a freight train? "Pretty much," Thal replied, his fingers no longer dancing over the interface so much as pounding it. "And the train's picking up speed." Ariadne turned to Thal, her expression calculating, like a poker player deciding whether to fold or go all in on a pair of fives. "Any luck on your end?" Thal shook his head, a grimace etched into his features. "They've upped their surveillance. I'm seeing advanced sensors pinging our systems. Nothing subtle about it either. More like they're trying to smash our window with a brick." "Perfect," Ariadne muttered, sarcasm dripping from her voice like honey from a hive. "Just what we needed, a brick through the proverbial glass." "We could always bluff," Cade suggested, always quick to double down on the impossible. "Pretend we're still in control." "Yeah, because bluffing's worked so well so far," Celine shot back, her sarcasm as thick as the Zalkron's skulls. "What's next?" "We challenged them to a duel with squirt guns." Ariadne rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar throb of an impending headache. "We need to rethink our strategy, adapt on the fly." Cade leaned back, the picture of relaxed defiance. "Fake it till we make it, right? Or fake it till we explode," Thal grumbled, typing furiously as he attempted to reroute power to the casino floor, keeping the games running despite the imminent threat of shutdown. "All right," Ariadne said, her voice low and measured. "We need to keep this place operational. Thal, see if you can throw those sensors off our trail, make them think they're scanning a ghost ship or something equally uninteresting." Thal raised an eyebrow. "A ghost ship, really?" "Hey, it's space. Stranger things have happened," Ariadne replied with a shrug. "Just do your techno-wizard thing." "Wasn't planning on doing anything else," Thal muttered, concentrating fiercely. "As for the rest of us," Ariadne continued, her gaze sweeping the room, "we need to keep the Zalkron distracted. Cade, you're on crowd control. Keep them entertained, confused, whatever it takes." "Consider it done," Cade said, snapping his fingers with a grin. "They won't know what hit them." "And Celine," Ariadne added, "keep an eye on their drinks. Last thing we need is a sober Zalkron remembering they have a job to do." "Got it." "Intoxication station open for business," Celine said, her sarcasm rivaling her bartending skills. With their roles assigned, the crew sprang into action, determined to stave off disaster for a little while longer. The tension in the air was palpable, each tick of the clock like a countdown to the inevitable showdown. Cade took to the floor, pulling out every trick in the book to keep the Zalkron entertained. He juggled, he joked, he pulled coins from behind their ears. Anything to keep their focus away from the fact that their wallets were slowly shriveling like raisins in the sun. Celine, meanwhile, was doing her best impression of a benevolent bartender, keeping the drinks flowing and the spirits high. "Try the special," she urged, handing over a concoction that smelled suspiciously like jet fuel. "It's on the house." The Zalkron were only too happy to comply, their inhibitions dissolving with each sip. Celine leaned in, her voice low and conspiratorial. "You know, this is the kind of night stories are made of. You'll be telling your grandkids about this one." The Zalkron nodded enthusiastically, already imagining their future tall tales, oblivious to the fact that the tale would likely end with them broke and bemused. Behind the scenes, Thal was locked in a battle of wits with the Zalkron surveillance system. He worked feverishly, every keystroke a silent prayer to whatever god watched over gamblers and fools. "Come on, you piece of junk," he whispered to the console, willing it to obey. Ariadne paced like a caged tiger, her mind a whirlwind of possibilities and permutations. She knew they were running out of time and luck, and both were in short supply. Finally, Thal let out a triumphant shout. "Got it. I've rerouted the sensors to scan a nearby asteroid field. Should keep them busy for a bit." "Good work," Ariadne said, a smile flickering across her lips. "Let's hope it buys us enough time to figure out our next move." Cade returned to their side, his expression a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. "I've bought us some goodwill, but it won't last forever." "It never does," Celine agreed, glancing at the Zalkron, who were now deeply engrossed in a drinking game they didn't realize they'd already lost. Ariadne knew they were living on borrowed time, but she couldn't help but feel a thrill at the challenge. "All right, let's keep this chaos controlled for as long as we can. We're not out of the woods yet, but we're not beaten either." The Iors dragged on, a relentless march of tension and adrenaline. The Zalkron, oblivious to the machinations around them, continued to indulge in the intoxicating mix of games and drinks, their suspicions dulled by the haze of alcohol and distraction. But Ariadne knew it wouldn't last. Sooner or later, they'd realize the truth. And when they did, it would be time for the dauntless crew to make their escape, leaving chaos and confusion in their wake. "What's the plan for when they figure it out?" Cade asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and resignation. Ariadne paused, considering the question. "We improvise," she said finally, her tone light but her eyes serious. "We get out of here with our skin intact and live to gamble another day." "Sounds like a plan," Thal said with a nod. Celine raised her glass, a wry smile playing on her lips. "To living dangerously and making history," Ariadne added, lifting an imaginary glass in response. The crew shared a moment of camaraderie, a brief respite in the storm. They were a motley crew, brought together by chance and held together by a shared love of chaos. And if anyone could pull off the impossible, it was them. As the night wore on, the Zalkron officials remained blissfully unaware of the ticking time bomb beneath their feet. They laughed, they drank, they gambled, all the while oblivious to the fact that their fortunes were evaporating faster than a puddle on a desert planet. Ariadne watched it all with a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. They'd pulled off the impossible before, and they'd do it again. But in the back of her mind, she knew the clock was ticking and their luck couldn't hold out forever. As the night drew to a close, the dauntless crew prepared for the inevitable showdown. They knew the Zalkron would soon discover the truth, and when they did, there would be hell to pay. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. Whatever happened next, they'd face it together, with a grin and a wisecrack. And maybe, just maybe, they'd pull off the greatest con in history and live to tell the tale. As the Zalkron officials finally began to piece together the enormity of their losses, their confusion turned to suspicion, and their suspicion to anger. The mood in the room shifted, a palpable tension crackling through the air like static electricity. Ariadne knew the moment of truth had arrived. It was time to make their move and get out while they still could. "All right, team," she said, her voice low but urgent. "It's time to wrap this up. We're making our exit before they realize just how bad things have gotten." Cade nodded, his expression serious but determined. "Let's make it a good one." Thal finished his work at the console, ensuring their path would be clear. "Everything's set. We just need to get out of here." Celine tossed back the last of her drink, a wry smile on her lips. "Let's go before they realize they've been robbed blind." Together, the crew of the Dauntless prepared to make their escape, leaving the Zalkron officials reeling in their wake. It was a gamble, a high-stakes game of chance, but they were ready to roll the dice one last time. As they made their way to the exit, Ariadne couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement. They'd pulled off the impossible once again, and they'd lived to tell the tale. To survival, she said, raising an imaginary glass in a final toast. And to the next adventure, Cade added, a grin spreading across his face. With a final nod to each other, the crew made their way into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them beyond the stars. After all, in a universe of uncertainty, the only sure bet was each other, and that was a gamble they were willing to take. Ariadne Voss peered through the jagged window of the Dauntless's captain's quarters, chewing on a thumbnail with the kind of vigor normally reserved for small rodents. The Zalkron had finally pieced together their puzzle, and the sight below her was as heartwarming as a viper pit. Zalkron officials, their faces flushed with realization and alcohol, were swarming the casino floor like a horde of angry bees with gambling debts. "It's like watching an avalanche in slow motion," Ariadne muttered, turning to Cade, who was fiddling with his deck of cards in that compulsive way of his. His optimism seemed to flicker in the face of impending doom, but only just. It was probably the first time she'd seen his smile falter, and she couldn't say she liked it. "Guess they finally figured out how much the house took," Cade said, grinning despite the situation. "I'd say we did our job too well," Ariadne snorted. "Well, if we're gonna go out, at least we did it with style." The Dauntless, their ramshackle sanctuary, was being breached by the Zalkron's finest, or at least, by those sober enough to remember their ranks. They poured through the casino, shouting orders, waving weapons, and generally creating an ambience that screamed tax audit gone intergalactic, doctor. Celine was already in the makeshift bar, perched on a stool with a drink that might as well have been made from the ship's fuel reserves. "Ah, the cavalry's here," she drawled, watching the chaos unfold. "And they brought the apocalypse with them." "Do you think they'll take a bribe?" Cade asked, sidling up beside her, his tone only half joking. "I've got a few shiny rocks that might persuade them." Celine rolled her eyes. "They might accept your head on a platter if you're lucky." Meanwhile, Thal was neck-deep in the console's guts, trying to coax some last shreds of cooperation from a system that was about as consistent as Cade's poker face. "I've got nothing," he grunted, sweat beading on his forehead. "They've overridden everything." "It's like trying to reason with a brick wall that hates you." "Sounds like my last relationship," Cade quipped, earning a half-hearted chuckle from Celine. Ariadne knew they were out of options. The Zalkron were closing in faster than a bill collector at a gambler's convention. She needed to make a call, and fast. "All right, we split up. Try to get as many of us out as we can." Cade nodded, his eyes scanning the room, calculating odds that were rapidly dwindling. "I'll try to keep their attention. Maybe we can finagle a now you see me, now you don't trick." "Buy us time," Celine said, her voice laced with a grim determination. "I'll handle extraction. Get the ones we can to the escape pods." "This is gonna be messy," Thal grumbled, standing up and brushing dust from his hands. "Like end-of-the-world Christmas shopping messy." "Messy's my middle name," Ariadne said, cracking a grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let's move, team." They dispersed into the chaos, each disappearing into the burgeoning madness. Ariadne watched as Cade sauntered up to the Zalkron with the kind of swagger that suggested he either had a plan or was too stupid to realize he didn't. She hoped it was the former. "Who's ready for a magic trick?" Cade's voice rang out, cutting through the noise with the precision of a scalpel. "Pick a card, any card." It was the kind of distraction that would work only on people who'd lost as many brain cells as they had credits. Fortunately, the Zalkron fit that description quite nicely. They paused, confusion flickering in their beady eyes as Cade's hands danced through the air, cards fluttering like butterflies on amphetamines. While Cade entertained their uninvited guests, Celine was already moving among the crew, herding bewildered gamblers towards the ship's underbelly where, hopefully, escape pods were still a viable option. You know, she mused aloud, I always imagined my retirement would involve less running and more sunbathing. This is why people shouldn't dream. Ariadne was following at a distance, keeping an eye on their exit path. She trusted Celine to handle the logistics, but if there was one thing she'd learned in her years captaining this hunk of junk, it was that nothing ever went according to plan. And right on cue, things went from bad to worse. A fresh wave of Zalcron stormed in from the side corridors, their weapons raised and expressions twisted with the kind of malevolent glee that came from realizing your opponent was well and truly screwed. Ah, reinforcements, Thal said, appearing at her side, a grim smile etched on his face. Just what we needed. Ariadne swore under her breath, her mind racing. We're not going to make it to the pods, are we? Thal shook his head. Not unless you know a dance move that can get us through 20 armed guards. I've been practicing my cha-cha, she quipped, but I left my dance shoes on the ship. The Zalcron closed in, their leader stepping forward with a swagger that suggested he was really enjoying his moment of triumph. Surrender and maybe we'll let you keep your limbs. Tempting offer, Ariadne said, her tone dry enough to rival a desert. But I've grown kind of attached to my limbs. The Zalcron leader sneered, gesturing for his men to move in. The game was up and the only thing they could do was prepare to be dragged away in chains, or worse. What's the plan, boss? Thal asked, his voice low. Ariadne glanced at him, then at the Zalcron advancing. We improvise, she said finally, and pray. As if on cue, a loud crash echoed from the direction of the makeshift bar. Cade was down, sprawled on the floor in a heap of cards and broken glass, looking less like a magician and more like a very unlucky rabbit pulled out of a hat. Looks like our luck just ran out, Cade said, coughing slightly, as the Zalcron closed in around him. Luck was never our strong suit, Ariadne murmured, raising her hands as the Zalcron leader gestured with his weapon, clearly enjoying his new role as captor of the universe's most dysfunctional crew. As the Zalcron assembled their prisoners, Ariadne's mind was already racing ahead, trying to figure out their next move. The casino floor was wrecked, the crew was scattered, and the Dauntless was looking less like a spaceship and more like a very expensive paperweight. Been an honor, Thal muttered, standing straight as their captors began to bind their wrists. If this is the end, it's never the end, Ariadne replied, her voice carrying a confidence she didn't fully feel. Just another beginning. Philosophical to the bitter end, Celine said, her sarcasm biting despite the situation. Let's hope it doesn't actually come to that. The Zalcron marched them through the corridors, their footsteps echoing with the finality of a death knell. Ariadne couldn't help but wonder if this was how it ended. Not with a bang, but with the systematic clanking of metallic boots on the deck of their beloved Dauntless. Love what they've done with the place, Cade muttered as they were herded into one of the ship's holding bays, now repurposed as a makeshift prison. Really captures that end-of-the-world vibe. Ariadne glanced around at her crew. They were battered, bruised, and a little worse for wear, but they were still together, and that at least was something. I don't know about the rest of you, she said, but I think it's time we made a plan. Cade grinned despite the circumstances. Fake it till we make it, or till we escape, Celine suggested, her tone as dry as a bone. Preferably option 2, Thal said, rolling his shoulders as if trying to shrug off the chains that bound him. I'm not a fan of dying on this rock. Ariadne nodded, feeling a spark of hope igniting in her chest. The Zalcron might have captured them, but it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The crew of the Dauntless had a knack for doing the impossible, and if there was a way out, they'd find it. Together, they'd face whatever came next, with wit, sarcasm, and a healthy dose of gallows humor. Because in the grimdark universe they called home, sometimes laughter was the only weapon left in their arsenal. The door to the makeshift prison creaked open, and Ariadne found herself staring at a room that could generously be described as quaint. The walls were lined with the kind of rust that would give a tetanus shot second thoughts, and the single flickering light overhead added just the right touch of post-apocalyptic charm. Home sweet home, Cade remarked, leaning against the wall with the kind of bravado that usually came right before a foolish decision. I give it a 5-star rating on Space Yelp. I've seen worse, Thal muttered, plopping down onto a crate. Granted, that was when I was being chased by a carnivorous plant, but still. Celine leaned against the doorframe, looking like she was contemplating how much trouble she'd get into for using a bottle as a weapon. "So, what's the master plan, O fearless leader?" she asked Ariadne, her voice dripping with sarcasm and the faint hope that this wasn't their final resting place. Ariadne looked around at her ragtag crew, each of them carrying the weight of their own dubious pasts but still alive and kicking. For now. "All right, folks, huddle up. We're not out of this yet." The crew gathered, forming a loose circle that looked more like a support group for terminal pessimists than a team of galactic outlaws. Ariadne took a breath, ignoring the smell that suggested the room had been used for organic storage at some unfortunate point in the past. "We need to regroup in the subspace pocket," Ariadne began, keeping her voice low. "Cade, you're on distraction duty again." Cade grinned, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "I can always juggle knives, or, dodge bullets." "Same difference, right? Just don't drop anything sharp," Celine interjected. "We've got enough holes in our plan already." Thal scratched his head. "And what about the Empire's penchant for gambling? I mean, they're practically drooling over anything shiny that promises a payout." That gave Ariadne an idea, one that danced dangerously close to genius or insanity, two things that often held hands in her line of work. "We use their greed against them, set traps within their games, rig the odds in our favor." Celine raised an eyebrow. "So we're gonna con the conmen. I like it. It's so beautifully ironic." "Works for me," Thal said, a glint of determination in his eye. "Let's show them what happens when you bet against the house." The idea was simple: leverage the Zalkron's addiction to risk and their overconfidence in their own systems. Make them believe they're winning when, in reality, they're marching headlong into a trap. "Here's the plan," Ariadne said, laying it out like a game of cosmic chess with stakes that included their freedom and possibly their lives. "We infiltrate the games. Thal, you'll work on the tech. Make sure their computers think they're winning until they're not." Thal nodded, his fingers itching for a console. "I'll have to get creative, but I love a challenge. And I'll bet they haven't updated their firewall since the last Galactic War. Cade, keep them distracted. If they think they are on a winning streak, they'll be too busy counting their imaginary credits to notice us." Cade held up his deck of cards. "No problem. I'll have them so busy they'll forget what they're supposed to be doing. And if that doesn't work, I'll just dazzle them with my sparkling personality. And Celine," Ariadne continued, her eyes meeting the doctor's, "will need your expertise to handle any unforeseen circumstances." Celine gave a wry smile. "Unforeseen circumstances? You mean like us getting shot or blown up?" "Yeah, I can handle that." Ariadne nodded, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline that came from having a plan, even a half-baked one. "Then let's do what we do best, cause chaos, survive, and maybe, just maybe, get out of this alive." They nodded, a united front against the absurdity of their situation. It wasn't a perfect plan. Hell, it wasn't even a good plan, but it was something. And sometimes, in their line of work, something was all you needed. The crew set to work, transforming their cell of doom into a base of operations. Thal was hunched over a console, typing furiously like his life depended on it, which, to be fair, it did. Cade was practicing his card tricks, flicking cards into the air with a flourish that made them look like tiny, deadly boomerangs. Celine was meticulously organizing her med kit, readying herself for whatever fresh hell awaited them. And Ariadne watched over them, pulling the strings of their chaotic, harebrained scheme. "How are we doing on that tech, Thal?" Ariadne asked, peering over his shoulder. "Piece of cake," Thal replied, though his voice suggested the cake was both metaphorical and on fire. "Once I bypass their security protocols, we can manipulate the odds. They'll think they are on a winning streak until we pull the plug." Ariadne nodded, her mind a whirlwind of calculations and scenarios. "Good." Keep at it. Meanwhile, Cade was preparing for his part in the grand charade, practicing his sleight of hand with the precision of a surgeon. "You know," he said to no one in particular, "if we pull this off, we should open a casino or at least write a self-help book." Celine rolled her eyes. "How to play life, cheat, lie, and occasionally run for your life." Cade chuckled. "That's a bestseller right there." With their respective tasks set in motion, the crew prepared for the next phase of their plan. It was a gamble, but they were used to playing with high stakes. After all, what was life without a little risk and an unhealthy dose of insanity? "All set," Thal announced, stepping back from the console. "The Empire's systems are now our systems. We've got them right where we want them." "Great," Ariadne said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Let's give them a show they'll never forget." The plan was simple. While the Zalkron officials were busy chasing phantom profits in their rigged games, the crew would use the opportunity to slip away. It was a long shot, but if there was one thing Ariadne trusted, it was her crew's ability to dance on the knife's edge between catastrophe and victory. Celine glanced at the door, already imagining the chaos they were about to unleash. "I've got a bad feeling about this," she said, though her tone suggested it was a feeling she was well acquainted with. Ariadne smirked. "That's just the adrenaline talking, and the overwhelming odds against us. Nothing new." With a final nod, Ariadne led the way as they slipped back into the heart of the ship, ready to set their plan into motion. The Zalkron thought they had them cornered, but they hadn't counted on the crew's particular brand of madness. The casino floor was a riot of lights and noise, the perfect backdrop for their daring escape. Zalkron officials were scattered around, oblivious to the tightening noose of their own hubris. "Showtime," Cade whispered, flashing a grin that was equal parts cocky and reckless. He stepped forward, preparing to unleash his arsenal of tricks and distractions. Cards flew through the air, a kaleidoscope of misdirection that drew the eyes of every Zalkron in the room. It was a masterclass in chaos theory, with Cade as the lead conductor of an orchestra of pandemonium. While the Zalkron were mesmerized by his performance, Thal worked his magic on the systems, sending the odds spiraling in the crew's favor. The officials were too busy riding their imaginary high to notice the walls closing in around them. In the midst of the chaos, Celine and Ariadne slipped through the crowds, their path carved by the bedlam of their own making. With each step, they moved closer to freedom, closer to the escape pods that promised a lifeline amidst the madness. "Keep it up, Cade," Ariadne murmured into her calm, her voice barely audible above the din. "We're almost there." With the Zalkron distracted and the odds stacked against them, the crew made their move. It was a dance of desperation and ingenuity, each step calculated, each action a gamble in its own right. As they reached the escape pods, Ariadne took a moment to look back at the chaos they'd wrought, a masterpiece of misdirection and deceit. It was a testament to their resilience, their ability to turn the tables even in the darkest of circumstances. "All right, everyone," she said, her voice carrying the weight of their shared struggle. "Let's get out of here." With a collective breath, the crew climbed into the pods, each of them carrying the weight of their shared history and the hope of a future free from the shackles of the Zalkron. As the escape pods launched into the void, Ariadne allowed herself a moment of reflection. They'd played the hand they were dealt, twisted the odds in their favor, and come out on top. It wasn't the first time, and it certainly wouldn't be the last, but for now they were free, and that was enough. Cade's voice crackled through the comms, a hint of triumph in his tone. "Well, that was fun. Same time next week." Ariadne couldn't help but laugh, a sound that echoed with the relief of narrowly escaping the jaws of defeat. "Sure thing, Cade. But next time, you're buying the drinks." As the Dauntless faded into the distance, the crew prepared to face whatever awaited them in the vast expanse of space. Together, they'd overcome the odds, and together, they'd continue to laugh in the face of adversity, captains of their own fate, navigating the cosmos with equal parts cunning and camaraderie. The Dauntless hummed with an uneasy silence as the crew's escape pods drifted toward freedom. Ariadne, with her usual flair for gallows humor, couldn't help but quip, "Well, if that didn't blow up in our faces, nothing will. Except maybe next week's plan." Cade's voice crackled over the comms, an audible grin in every word. "Next week's plan. Do I need to start taking notes now, or can I just wing it like usual?" Celine, ever the realist with a penchant for sarcasm, chimed in. "Why start planning now, Cade? I mean, it's not like winging it has ever landed us in a death trap or anything." Thal, their tech guru who'd just finished manipulating enough code to turn the Empire's own greed against them, snorted. "Remind me again why we're not all in loony bins." "Because," Ariadne replied without missing a beat, "we've blown those up too." As they drifted further from the Dauntless, Ariadne's mind raced with 1,000 calculations. The Zalkron's obsession with gambling had been their undoing. All she had to do was tug on the right threads, and the Empire's overconfidence would unravel like a cheap sweater at a yard sale. And now, as they coasted toward relative safety, the real work began, negotiating with a power that didn't know the first thing about losing. The Zalkron Empire wasn't exactly the forgiving type. They'd sooner blow a planet to bits than admit defeat. But Ariadne had one thing in her favor, the element of surprise, and maybe a smidge of blackmail. "All right, everyone," she said, voice steady and low, "time to put on our best poker faces. We're gonna negotiate with these bastards, and by negotiate, I mean leverage every dirty trick we've got." Cade's response was swift and full of bravado. "I've got a killer smile and a loaded deck. What more do we need?" "How about not dying?" Celine suggested dryly. "Details, details," Cade retorted with a chuckle that belied the tension in his voice. As their escape pods drifted into the meeting zone, Ariadne keyed in the comms for the Zalkron. She half expected them to ignore her, or worse, blow them out of the sky. Instead, a voice crackled through the static, dripping with arrogance. "This is Commander Zhao of the Zalkron." "State your business, Commander Zhao," Ariadne said, letting a smirk seep into her voice. "We both know your empire has a bit of a gambling problem. Well, it seems you've bet more than you can afford to lose this time." Zhao's silence was deafening for a moment before he replied. "Speak quickly, human. My patience is as thin as your air supply." "Oh, I bet it is," Ariadne continued, unperturbed. "You see, we've rigged your games, and now your economy's about as stable as a drunken skiff on a stormy sea. What do you say we make a deal before your empire collapses under the weight of its own stupidity?" The pause on the other end was long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Cade whispered, "I think we might have pissed him off." "Good," Celine whispered back. "Angry people make mistakes." Finally, Zhao's voice returned, clipped and icy. "And what is it you propose, Captain Voss?" Ariadne leaned back, feigning nonchalance. "Simple. You ease off trying to blow us to bits, and we tell you how to unfuck your economy. And in return, you relinquish control of that little planetary core you've been toying with." A low chuckle escaped Thal, who muttered, "Never thought economic warfare would be our thing." Zhao's voice was a hiss. "Do you think we are fools, Captain? You cannot possibly control the entire Empire's economy with a few games." Ariadne shrugged, though the gesture was lost across the comm. "Maybe. But are you really going to risk it? You know as well as I do that rumors spread faster than light. All it takes is one whisper that the Zalkron aren't as invincible as they pretend to be." Silence stretched again, and the crew exchanged glances, the kind that spoke of shared anxiety and the hope of pulling off yet another impossible feat. Finally, Zhao spoke, his tone begrudgingly respectful. "Very well, Captain Voss. You have your truce, but know this, we do not take kindly to humiliation." Ariadne smiled, a predator's grin. "Neither do we, Commander, neither do we." The comms clicked off, leaving the crew in a hushed silence. Cade, always the first to break it with humor, said, "Well, that went better than expected. I was half expecting them to send a nuke our way." Celine shook her head, her expression a mix of relief and exasperation. "If they did, it wouldn't be the first time we've outrun an explosion. Just another day in our wonderfully chaotic lives. As the escape pods docked back with the Dauntless, Ariadne took a moment to savor the victory. They'd outsmarted a galactic empire, turned their own games against them, and lived to tell the tale. Not bad for a day's work. "All right, team," she said, addressing the crew with a spark in her eye. "We've got a bit of breathing room, but let's not get too comfortable. We need to make sure the Zalkron don't decide to renege on our little deal." Thal was already back to tinkering, no doubt plotting the next tech marvel to save their skins. Cade shuffled his cards with a practiced ease, and Celine began her usual task of restocking their woefully empty med kit. "Think they'll keep their word?" Cade asked, his gaze fixed on Ariadne. She shrugged. "About as likely as us not pissing off another empire within the week," Celine chuckled. "So, not bloody likely then." With the ship back in their hands and a tenuous piece carved from chaos, Ariadne took a moment to herself, gazing out at the expanse of space. It was vast, unforgiving, and full of opportunities to either make a fortune or get blown to bits. But for now they had the upper hand, and that was more than enough. Cade wandered up beside her, his usual swagger tempered with genuine curiosity. "So, what's next, fearless leader?" Ariadne smirked, her mind already racing with possibilities. "Next, we make sure the Zalkron know their place. After that, who knows? Maybe we'll find another empire that needs a good shake-up." Cade nodded, his grin infectious. "And if all else fails, there's always the casino idea, or the self-help book," Celine added, joining them with a wry smile. Thal looked up from his console, his expression one of amused resignation. How to play life, cheat, lie, and occasionally run for your life. Ariadne laughed, the sound ringing through the ship like a bell of defiance. "Exactly. And if that doesn't work, we'll just keep doing what we do best: survive." As the crew settled into their familiar rhythm of banter and preparation for whatever madness would come next, the Dauntless sailed through the stars, a testament to the indomitable spirit of humanity, with all its flaws and brilliance. For now, they'd won a small victory, and in the grand scheme of things, that's all they could ask for. But tomorrow was another day, and in the unpredictable cosmos, who could say what insanity awaited them next? The comms crackled to life again, this time with a message of genuine gratitude from an unexpected source. "Captain Voss," Zhal's voice came through, devoid of its earlier hostility. "I must admit, your solution has stabilized our systems. You've saved us from a disaster of our own making." Ariadne couldn't resist a final jab. "Glad we could help, Zhal. Just remember, next time you want to gamble, try betting on something less destructive, like a two-legged race." Zhal chuckled, a sound that was surprisingly human. "Noted, Captain. Until we meet again." As the line went dead, Ariadne turned back to her crew, who were watching her with expectant eyes. "Looks like we've made a friend," she said, the irony not lost on her. "Friend?" Cade snorted. "More like a frenemy, maybe." Celine shook her head. "Better an empire with a grudging respect than one that wants us dead." "Either way," Thal added, "we've got a bit of breathing room." "And breathing room," Ariadne declared, "is all we need to keep doing what we do best." With that, the Dauntless and her crew sailed on, a beacon of chaos and cunning in an indifferent universe. They'd flipped the tables on a galactic empire, saved themselves from certain doom, and somehow come out on top. But they knew the game was far from over, and in a universe full of risks waiting to be taken, they wouldn't have it any other way. Ariadne Voss stared at the murky projection in front of her, chewing on a thumbnail like it owed her money. The Dauntless was finally in a position where the alarms weren't screeching like banshees, and the Zalkron Empire had slunk off to lick its wounds, leaving a trail of damaged pride and shattered egos. In other words, they'd managed to royally piss off an interstellar empire and come out alive. Not a bad day's work for a ragtag team of misfits. "All right, folks," Ariadne announced, turning to her crew. "We've got the planetary core under control, and by control, I mean it's not about to explode. Celebrate quietly. We don't want the universe to get the wrong idea and think we're competent." Cade was lounging in the corner, shuffling a deck of cards with the kind of dexterity that suggested he'd been using them for more than just playing games. Competent, us. That'd ruin our reputation. Celine, sipping something from a suspiciously clean cup, raised an eyebrow. And what reputation is that? The one where we keep stumbling into success against all odds. Everyone's got to have a brand. Cade shot back with a grin that could sell snake oil to a snake. Thal, always the voice of tech-infused reason, glanced up from his console. Let's just hope the Zalkron decide to keep their distance. If they come back, I can't promise I'll be able to hack their entire system again. More like if they come back, I'll need a bigger flask, Celine muttered, taking another swig. Ariadne snorted. If they come back, I'll need a bigger ship. But for now, we're in the clear. We've got the core stabilized, which means we've got leverage. Leverage, Thal echoed, his fingers dancing over a holographic keyboard. Nice way of saying we've got them by the metaphorical balls. Exactly, Ariadne said, eyes gleaming with that dangerous mix of intelligence and gallows humor that had somehow kept them alive this long. And now it's time to make sure the Zalkron don't forget that. The planet they were orbiting was a drab, inhospitable rock, barely worth mentioning in any interstellar guidebook. Space Yelp would have given it 1 star, tops, and only because it was still technically in orbit. But it had a core that the Zalkron had been using as a massive, unstable battery. Now that it was in human hands, they had the keys to the universe's least desirable timeshare. Think they'll try to take it back? Cade asked, dealing a hand of cards to himself that he immediately folded. We did kind of give them a wedgie on a galactic scale. Celine rolled her eyes. They might come back, but they are not idiots. They know we can outsmart them. Or at least annoy them to death. Plus, Thal added, their economy's still in the toilet. They've got bigger fish to fry, or not fry, since they probably can't afford the energy costs. Ariadne nodded, contemplating their next move. All right, here's the plan. We set up a little outpost here. Keep an eye on things, make sure that core doesn't become a giant planet-sized firecracker. Cade raised a hand. Question, why do we care again? I mean, besides the whole not getting blown up thing. Ariadne sighed, the kind that speaks of exasperation with the world at large. Because, Cade, we need to make sure this place stays calm and doesn't attract attention from any other would-be dictators. Plus, having a base of operations